Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today our guest is Thomas John Hearn, who is a senior social worker for the state of Idaho within the Department of Health and Welfare. We're going to be discussing with you the topic child abuse. Our guest, Mr. Hearn, holds a BA degree in psychology and sociology from California State University at Chico. He also holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Washington in Seattle. Mr. Hearn has been in Coeur d'Alene for a number of years, and in his particular capacity at this time, he is responsible for a child protection caseload of primarily child abuse cases. Mr. Hearn, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to welcome to the panel to assist me in questioning our guest, first of all, regular panelist Lou Reed, and our second panel member is Dr. Owen Cargill, Director of Planning and Associate Dean of Instruction at North Idaho College. I would invite Lou Reed to commence the questioning.
Tom, child abuse comes in many forms. Would you outline for us what those forms are? What kinds of acts do we call child abuse?
Well, from our perspective, child abuse is related to what the law says child abuse is. We put a great deal of emphasis on what we do in working closely by the Child Protective Act, which is the law in Idaho which mandates Department of Health and Welfare involvement in child abuse cases.
So it would be helpful if you tell us what the law says.
Okay.
Then.
The law specifically defines abuse in terms of injury to children. There's a number of sections of the law. The four primary sections that we're involved in are abuse, which is physical injury to children. That can be bruising, burns, whatever is visible to us and to a doctor. A recent section of the law, which was placed in the law last summer, is a section on sexual conduct, and that includes rape, molestation, incest, prostitution, etc. Mm-hmm. Another section of law, two other sections of law we deal with are abandonment cases, where children have been left without proper care and by their parents, generally speaking, and also neglect. Neglect is very broadly defined as in terms of without proper parental care and control, which is such a broad term that normally that's left up to
I would suspect that neglect is probably the most prevalent, but what are, of those three other kinds, what are the most commonly reported to your office?
I would say the majority of complaints we get are of the neglect area. Of the other types, we've had a significant rise in child sexual abuse referrals to our office. Last year, 1982, our local office in Kootenai County investigated 43 complaints of sexual abuse of children. That's quite a rise over previous years, and that's been a significant problem. As far as the kinds of cases of serious injury to children, broken bones and kinds of cases like that get a lot of publicity, we don't really see that much of it. We see them on occasion. The average kind of child abuse case actually would be more of a bruising situation caused by excessive discipline or something like that.
Thank you.
Dr. Cargill.
Mr. Hearn, I'm wondering if you could identify whether or not the major kinds of child abuse here in the Northwest are similar to other forms of child abuse in other parts of the country, or if we have any special problems that are isolated to this particular region.
From what my understanding, I think we're have about the same kinds of problems as that are reported on a nationwide basis. I do know that some of the recent research by the federal government and by a man named David Finkelhor of the Family Violence Research Center at the University of New Hampshire indicate that there seems to be a significant increase or a significant portion of sexual abuse cases in rural areas. So I think probably it's safe to say that we may have more sex abuse cases here than other areas, but I don't know if that's really supported by research. We've had a lot of those kinds of complaints.
Is that because of the geographic isolation of communities?
Well, we find that isolation is one of the many factors that contributes to sexual abuse. Families being extremely isolated from community standards, from support systems, extremely rigid value structures, extremely conservative values seem to influence those things. A lot of other things influence sexual abuse, but one thing we do know, I think, is that isolation is a factor. If these families are isolated, and they can be isolated in the city also, but we have so many rural areas here, it's possible for families to get real back out in the country, and so that may be a contributing factor.
Thank you.
Mr. Hearn, I'm sure there are many of our viewers that are wondering about the procedures that are followed in your office within the state of Idaho. When you get complaints about either physical abuse, sexual abuse, or whatever it might come under of the 4 categories of the law, do you get these referrals from the police, or is it directly to your office from a member of the family? And what kind of rules do you have concerning confidentiality and privacy? I know that's a very general question, but I wish that you would be specific in indicating to the viewers exactly what kind of procedures are followed under the law as you deal with the cases.
Okay. As far as where we get our complaints, we get them from everywhere. I'd say when schools are in session, we might get a significant proportion from schools. Police inform us. The law states that the police are to inform us of child abuse and we're to inform them. So there's a lot of mutual exchange of information with the police.
So it can start either way.
Right. We get them from relation to, let's say, a child sexual abuse case. We may get it directly from the victim. It's more likely that we get a complaint from possibly a girlfriend of the victim, or maybe her mother, the mother of the girlfriend. Usually they come a roundabout way to us. They don't come directly from the victim. As far as the procedures that we follow in investigating these kinds of complaints, or complaints in general, again, that's the Child Protective Act, and state policy is pretty specific about what we can and cannot do. If it's a child sexual abuse case, we immediately inform the local law enforcement agency, and we work cooperatively on the investigation from the very beginning. Now, that's been a new procedure instituted in this county in the last year or so as a result of the increase in the child sexual abuse referrals. We recently developed a protocol between the police agencies, our office, and the prosecuting attorney's office to investigate those kinds of cases. But in any case, what we would normally do is we would go out and we would try and make contact with the victim, and we would interview her jointly. And as far as any kind of emergency action, that's primarily left up to the police officer. He has to make a decision at that point as to whether or not the child is in any kind of imminent danger. We consult very often and very quickly in these kinds of cases with the prosecuting attorney's office and take advice from them. But the immediate response is, and I think I'd like to dispel a myth here, the immediate response is not to remove children from homes. That's what we attempt to do, if at all possible, is, for instance, in a sex abuse case, would be to remove the offender. In other words, ask him to leave the home until we can get the matter resolved, instead of placing children in foster care, because we don't like having to victimize victims.
Am I also correct in my understanding that under the law and the procedures that these cases are handled with quite a great deal of delicacy as far as confidentiality? Even, I believe, is it not correct that when the offense is a criminal one and can require court action, that even that is handled somewhat different than the other types of crimes as far as how much is reported to the public?
Well, all child protective action is by statute confidential. But in terms of when you have criminal charges against people for abuse, physical or sexual abuse or neglect of children, you get into some touchy areas there about the public's right to know. We try as best as possible to keep the names of the families out, and certainly, if we can't do that, to keep the names of victims out. Sometimes the names of the offender, if he's found guilty, is published as public record, but in my experience, I don't think we've ever had the name of a victim published. We try and keep that out.
Okay. Lou Reed.
Tom, would you talk about the kinds of treatment and counseling that are available to the victims of child sexual abuse? And I suspect you also have to counsel with the non-offending parent, too.
Well, one of the big problems in Idaho is a real lack of treatment resources. I think we need to emphasize that. As far as victims are better off than offenders. We do have, by the Child Protective Act, requires us to either provide treatment ourselves or to make sure that treatment takes place of the victim, the non-offending parent, and, if possible, the offender. Unfortunately, with the way the situation is if there is the treatment that will, well, speaking specifically of this county, we do have access to some services in Spokane, which gives us some advantages over other areas.
By that, you mean what other services?
Treatment services in Spokane. For instance, there's a rape crisis unit at the Lutheran Social Services in Spokane that does some good treatment of victims and their mothers. We do provide some treatment here at the local mental health center. There's some private practitioners who provide treatment. Occasionally the social worker who is investigating the case, myself, will provide limited treatment of the victim and her mother. Now, in relation to offenders, it's a whole different story. Offender treatment is very badly needed in Idaho. Oftentimes when these cases come to our attention, the option that the judges have is either sending the man to prison, which is not helpful, or sending him or allowing him to stay in a community but under questionable treatment. That's one a real problem. It's something we're trying to work on is to establish treatment resources in this community.
You mean treatment resources, you do mean the services, or do you mean to get the dollars to make sure that there is an implementing program?
Well, I think both. I think we need the people with the specialized training who can treat offenders. Not the average counselor can treat offenders. It's a very difficult problem requiring specialized treatment. Washington State, for example, has inpatient treatment of offenders in state hospitals, and they have some pretty good outpatient treatment in some of the major cities. Idaho doesn't have an inpatient capacity for sexual offenders. If they are convicted of a sexual offense and the judge decides that they can't stay out in the community because of how dangerous they are, then they will usually just be jailed, and that's unfortunate.
When they're in jail, then they have no counseling?
The reality of it is we like to think that they get treatment in jail, but the reality is they really don't get treatment in jail.
Unfortunate.
Dr. Cargill.
Following up along this line of questioning, what are some of the long-term effects on the victims of child abuse, and can treatment ameliorate some of the psychological damage to the victims?
Well, there's been some pretty good research of that on long-term effects of victimization. What we have found in studying women who've been victimized, that I just want to refer to a study that I have here. Oftentimes, women who have been sexually abused will have significantly higher percentage of problems in interpersonal relationships, mistrust of men, negative self-image, depression, great deal of guilt. They frequently have guilt. They have guilt about keeping the act secret, about some of the incongruencies of the experiences. In other words, they may have felt in some ways they benefited in terms of kinds of privileges they got for the actions they were involved in. They have guilt about that. Complicity, I guess you would say. And there's a lot of problems that women have who've been sexually abused. Now, as far as treatment of victims, I think, is much better in general than treatment of offenders in terms of helping young children, adolescent girls grow up and to be normally well-adjusted women. We don't have. I think that's pretty well established. If they get good treatment, they're going to generally be okay. That's not the problem we have. Again, I'm getting back to the problem of offenders, but that's one that I have interest in, is the fact that offenders are very difficult to treat even under the best of circumstances, and they have a high recidivism rate, and so there's a concern about that. But to answer your question specifically, there is pretty good treatment available for victims, and most victims can be helped.
I would like to follow up on Dr. Cargill's question by talking about, I assume from the comments you've made that when women are victims, you're dealing with the comments of sexually abused. Let's carry that to the other points that are under the law that you deal with concerning any child that is abused, and I'm not speaking of sexual abuse now, I'm speaking of physical abuse that are oftentimes they're handled in a very harsh way and physically even beaten, and we see cases of even children being killed through that process, or where it's not a physical harm as far as abusing them, but they're psychologically abused by being yelled at or are often told that they're not worth very much, and that leaves results. What kind of data do you have that talks about these particular victims? How do they respond to life following this kind of abuse?
Well, some of the data that is available indicates that children who were abused will frequently become abusers if they don't get help. That's pretty well established. I think that there's lots of people who abuse children who never were abused themselves, but there seems to be a pattern there.
So you're saying later in life when they become parents themselves that they're likely to repeat what they have experienced?
It's possible if they haven't received treatment, right, that they could certainly, there's a repetition compulsion, when they're under the stress of parenting, which anybody who's been a parent realizes there's a lot of stresses, they tend to act the way that they were treated. Unless they've been able to come to some terms with that and realize that the way they were treated is not the way they want to raise their child. But a lot of it is that seems to be a real problem, and that if you don't provide treatment in the child abuse cases, there is good data, and I don't have all that research with me. I do have a study from the federal government, but there's good data to show that these kids have much higher rates of delinquency. As they're adults, they have much, they've done interviews or studies of prisoners who found out how many were abused as children. They have much higher divorce rates when they're adults, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a problem. If you don't deal with it early, it's going to come back later on through the juvenile justice system, typically.
It appears to me from the comments you're making that all human interrelationships become difficult for them later, if it's in their marriage or with their friends or with society in general. Is that an accurate statement?
I think that's accurate. I also think that there's a difference between the kind of one serious assault versus a pattern of assault. For instance, in dealing with sexual abuse cases, the child who is molested in the park, let's say, by a stranger, typically does a lot better than children who were molested over a long period of time by somebody they knew well, because the child can oftentimes put that up as an assault experience. It's like being beat up or being hit by a car or something's very traumatic and damaging to them, but they can deal with that better than a kid who's had to live with it for 5, 10, 15 years and who's had to keep it a secret and all that kind of thing. That creates a lot more damage, particularly if the offender is close to the victim, it's a member of the family.
Lou Reed.
Will you talk a little bit more about how you try to break the syndrome of the abused children becoming abusers? What are the patterns that you try to get through to, and by what methods?
That's a very difficult question. What we try to do, of course, is to identify the cases and to get them whatever treatment we can get them. Now that's as far as how. I guess I'm not clear how to answer that question. We try.
Is it individual in every single case, so that it's going to be it's the same syndrome, but the treatment will have to be.
It has to be individualized, depending on the response of the victim, for sure. If a child was, by the result of their abuses, has become psychotic, or has all kinds of delinquent behaviors, then you have to deal with their psychosis, and you have to deal with their delinquent behaviors.
So this may include medicine.
Well, usually the most effective treatment that I'm aware of involves a multitude of interventions. Psychological intervention, maybe some medical treatment if there's some damage there, some parenting kinds of things that help the victim learn better ways of coping with children. The best kinds of treatment are comprehensive. They don't just involve a victim seeing one mental health worker once every 2 or 3 weeks for an hour. It requires a community response too, supportive services from throughout the community, not just state agencies.
So you're wanting to change behavior in every way through as many educational and encouraging ways as possible.
Well, there's
I'd like to just sort of get some sort of key. Is it self-awareness? What is really going to make this person say, I don't want to ever beat my child because it was just because it was done to me, that I'm in control of the situation?
I guess I can't answer that question. We're going to say it depends on individual cases. Some people can, we look at our own childhood, we can look at things and say, even bad things that happen to us, and say, I don't want that to ever happen to me again or anybody I care about. And people can take positive, actions in their lives to prevent repetition of things that have happened in the past. Now, some people have more strength to do that than others. Frequently, another part of child abuse is the fact that this is pretty well documented in the research also, is that there's a much higher incidence of child abuse in the lower classes. So you're not only dealing with the violence directed against the child, but you're dealing with all kinds of of environmental stresses. You know, they may be dealing with alcoholism, they may be dealing with unemployment, they may be dealing with all these other kinds of factors that the person has to deal with, so that they can overcome that problem of possibly being an abusive parent.
I was asking for a simple answer, and there is not one.
There is
Obviously,
not a
it's a
simple
very
answer.
complicated situation.
And I think we're kidding ourselves. I think there are simple answers. I think that's been a real myth that's been perpetuated, is that we can easily resolve this problem by doing certain things, and I think it's a very complex problem.
Dr. Cargill.
Mr. Hearn, where could someone go if he or she felt that he might or she might have a tendency toward child abuse, or if a person might know of a situation where child abuse is occurring?
Well, if they know of a case, of child abuse, the law says that people are supposed to report. In fact, there's an obligation in
To the police?
Well, the statute says, I think it was Idaho Code 1619, which basically requires professionals, and they name them doctors, nurses, daycare center personnel, etc., to report to the proper law enforcement agency or the Department of Health and Welfare. And it also, there's a statement in the law that says, or other persons having knowledge of it, so that kind of generally includes everybody. The best place to report is either Department of Health and Welfare or the police, and as I said earlier, we exchange reports if they're serious. Now, as far as what people can do if they feel they have a tendency toward abuse, I would say the fact that they can recognize that is a good indication right there that they may be able to be helped. The fact that they can say that I have this problem, and I would seek out counseling. And there is some counseling available through the state, and there's quite a bit of counseling available through private resources.
Along on Dr. Cargill's question again, an individual comes to you, and this may be the victim, it may be an offender, and you're going to be dealing with the problem, and you're going to try to assist to help eliminate this problem. Could you share with our viewers who all might be involved in a more complex case, in addition to your office, or what kind of people you have in your office, and then what other groups outside of your office might be involved? I assume that particular individual may be working with several people during the rehabilitation.
Well, if you're talking about again, it depends on the type of case. Let's take a neglect case, for example. We haven't talked much about neglect. If we came to our attention and we were convinced that we had a serious case of neglect, the child was suffering in a way which the average person can see from inadequate parental care, then we would, if there was there'd probably be a petition filed, so there would be, so definitely the Department of Health and Welfare would be involved with the family, okay? And it's child protective social worker would have the primary responsibility to oversee what happens. Then you may have possibly a person from the health district who would help the mother, let's say, with nutrition problems with the child, maybe teach them some parenting skills. You might have a mental health worker involved if there's some clinical problems that need to be dealt with, some counseling problems. You may get, sometimes we have private community organizations that can help out through funds for either treatment or maybe help out paying the cost of housing. Really, neglect once you identify the problem, you bring as many people to bear as you can. So again, we have doctors, psychologists, nurses. It just depends on the seriousness of the case and what's in the treatment plan.
The educational system, the teachers, or something.
Very likely, if the child's attending school, that we would have a meeting with the teacher and a counselor at school to help out.
Okay. Lou Reed.
What about networks? Certainly in cases of sexual abuse, do you have networks that are available where people help each other?
Well, in this particular county, we have what we call a Kootenai County Child Sexual Abuse Network. That's been in effect for or in existence for about a year. And that's been a group of people who have been very much concerned about the problem. And we've looked at a number of different programs in the last year. The protocol that I mentioned earlier has been one outgrowth of the network to coordinate all of our activities better. But we're also looking at prevention and treatment issues. Treatment issues are a statewide issue, I think, as well as a local issue. So that's been a very gratifying thing about this particular county, I think, is that people have recognized the problem, and and a lot of different professionals from different areas have come together to work on the problem.
And concerned citizens?
Concerned citizens, right. We have a number of volunteers who are not professionals who who are interested in doing community prevention work. And so it's at this point there's probably about 10 to 20 people in the network, and they're again, we've approached the three areas of criminal justice, what needs to be done in the criminal justice system to deal with these problems better, what needs to be done in the educational system or prevention, get to families and kids before it becomes a problem, and then treatment. You know, what do we do about victim treatment? What do we do about offender treatment? Those have been the three primary issues we've been trying to deal with. Last year has been primarily oriented on criminal justice, but this year one of the plans of the network is to move more into prevention and treatment.
Dr. Cargill.
I wonder if you could share with our audience who abuses children. Are there types of individuals or personalities that are more inclined to engage in child abuse?
Well, again, we do know that the instance of physical abuse occurs more often in the lower classes. Okay, that's again is a myth that, you know, when the child abuse programs were originally placed into existence, that was kind of sold that it happens throughout classes of people. Well, it does, but the frequency is much greater with poor people of child abuse. Sexual abuse, however, does seem to be a problem, which is not closely related to one class. Now, as far as personalities, who abuses children, that's a difficult kind of thing to answer. There is some good research coming out in child sexual abuse to show certain kinds of psychological profiles of men who victimize children, and many of them seem to have a similar pattern on psychological tests. There's a test which is frequently used called the MMPI, and probably 75% of the offenders that I'm aware of have a similar profile on that test. That kind of stuff is, the good research in the area of child sexual abuse is not more than 5 or 10 years old, and so we don't really have a lot of answers there about who abuses children.
You alluded earlier that there might be long-term sexual abuse relationships with relatives. Is it more common that abuse would occur through a relative or strangers?
Well, the majority of abuse happens in the family. Either happens by a parent or a relative. I think the research I've seen says that, I'm just looking at some research here, 3/4 of the assaults are by someone the child knows, and at least half are by family members.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're out of time, and I wish we had more time. I want to express on behalf of our staff, Mr. Hearn, our thanks for your being here, and I would like to recognize and thank the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare for allowing you to come and take some time to be with us. I know our viewers enjoyed it, and our guest has been Thomas John Hearn, who is the senior social worker in our city and county for the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, and we've been discussing child abuse. I express my appreciation to the panel for fine questions. I hope you'll be with us again next week, and we again will discuss an important topic. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.